Hi, and welcome to Seminar 3 from Frontier Incubator's Scaling Programs series, Ready to Scale. Hopefully you have watched the webinar that goes with this module and are undertaking some of the tasks and reading that goes with it. Today it was a chance to talk things out, but most folks are pretty busy this week. So today we have just me and Junaid. But we're going to have a good conversation around a couple of things that came up. This week, Ready to Scale covered the viral framework and also some other design considerations, just double checking your readiness levels and whether it's possible to be fully ready for scaling up, or whether you have to just get stuck into it, learn as you go. Today's a seminar, a bit of a chance to talk things out. Junaid, I'm just going to come back to video here.
Sure.
Good to have you with us. Thank you for turning up.
Hi. Yep. How are you doing?
All good. All good. Busy times.
Awesome. Awesome.
But so the pressure's on you to have a good chat with me. We'll keep it short and sweet. But is there anything that stood out for you in the webinar that you'd like to talk about, or you think it's worth running over? Yeah.
So I think so. One of the things that we talked about last time was how the village capital presentation that Deepak had. How essentially we talked about the customization for it, because this is more targeted towards the entrepreneurs. But a lot of the struggles and challenges that are there for the entrepreneurs are similar to the people who are on the ecosystem development side, and how a lot of those things can be tailored, and some of the considerations can be made, which are and I mean we can go through the details of it. But essentially, a good framework. It kind of is a good introspection in a lot of ways. That if you're not scoring, if there are some outlier scores that you have, if you're overall an average of 5 somewhere, and somewhere you're at 9, somewhere you're at 2, then that's it's a good activity to kind of raise that red flag. So that's a slight customization, and I think as a reference point, it's a good handy tool where we can always conduct that activity to kind of get a snap check on where things are. And kind of recalibrate, perhaps.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah.
Just sharing that on the screen so that if people are watching again later, they've got reference to that. I know what you mean. It's and I think Deepak was raising this really well in the slides. That's a great invitation for us as a cohort through Frontier Incubators to come up with questions that are going to be relevant and useful for scaling entrepreneurial support organizations or accelerators and our programs around it. And that opportunity just to tailor it. We started it in Singapore, but it'd be great to finish that as an output from Frontier Incubators. So any thoughts people have about how we can tailor that, because we all are. I think it's a lovely point that we all are entrepreneurially proving that our ventures have a good market fit, that they work, that those accelerators are useful in different markets, and then trying to scale the programs into new markets is all about acquiring new customers and making sure that we are entrepreneurially selling what we do as well. So it's still a useful tool, as you say. I'm just gonna so highlighting the scaling up level as well, given that's the topic of this series. I think it's interesting what we find in there in terms of the definitions, that level 7 already making sure that you've got really good product market fit before scaling, absolutely crucial. And then level 8, some of the definitions in there, that's the thing to really pay attention to, I think. But some of those things there, systems level change being validated, stuff like that, is quite a high bar for scaling. But as you can see, under product, having strong customer product feedback in multiple markets, that requires you to have tested it within multiple markets first, not just in one. So a bracket where your readiness needs to be at level 7, and then level 8 is about testing it all over the place, and making sure, again, you've got brand established in hard to beat partnerships for distribution, marketing, and growth in your existing market, and well done in your domestic market, but then also in making sure you've got that in other places as well. So it's, again, they're pretty high bars, but and a very big bracket actually. What is scaling? Is it just one market or is it multiple? So yeah, lots to do in just tightening what that means for us.
And one of the things that also that came up, and that's something I'm here to more talk about, was the one of the other frameworks. So once you are at this level, I think using the disciplined entrepreneurship approach, which is part of the MIT's bootcamp. It's a book by Bill Ollett, who heads the Martin Center for Entrepreneurship, I believe, in MIT. And he came up with this book, and the book forms the core of their bootcamps, which I was able to attend in Brisbane and coached on one of their bootcamps in Cambridge. And the scaling up part is you already had the defining your core step, which is the number 10 step, already there. So hence the reason to kind of visit it. The idea of that is, so what we'll do today is just talk about the step number 10 in detail, but broadly speaking, bit of an introduction to the methodology. A lot of it is, stuff that most of us must have seen at some point in some form or the other. When we talk about, there is some element of lean methodology, there's some element of, how. So it's a lot of knowledge which already does exist. What they do nicely is put it together as a roadmap. So it's not disjointed. Obviously, it also has room for improvement, but it kind of gives you a step-by-step journey when you're starting out. And the good thing about this framework is that you can actually always revisit anytime you are let's say relaunching another vertical in product, or if you are exploring to scale to another market. You are in essence developing another startup in some ways. It's a different market, it's a different customer segment, and all of that. So it's a good handy visual, and there's a book available. It's available on Kindle as well, so you can always refer back to it. And steps are, if you go to the other slide, when we can come back to this one, steps are essentially categorized in the terminologies which are used are quite straightforward, right? So it starts from the customer. So who's your customer? What can you do for your customer? How do you acquire the customer? Then there is, how do you make money off your product? That making money off your product is integral in the methodology, because they're of the strong viewpoint that it's not a product if no one is paying to buy it, right? But obviously that kind of, again, the customer could be different in case of a lot of social enterprises, incubators, and accelerators. But the idea is that someone has to value it enough to be willing to put their money where their mouth is. How do you design and build your product, and eventually how do you scale? Also, do notice that some of these they're not like linear steps. For instance, if you look at who's your customer, the first 5 steps are linear. Then you figure out what you can do for those customers that you identified for the first set of the customer, and then you come back to the step of finding your customer, and that's the next 10 customers. So a lot of these steps are not necessarily linear, but they are, and which makes sense, right? You identify first set of friends, customers, and then you run the whole course with them, make a product, sell it to them, reach out to them, and then you move on and repeat the exercise in some way. So that is in essence what it's a step-by-step process, fairly easy to follow, and a lot of resources available around it. You won't have first-hand experience, you can also join one of the bootcamps as well. But I think books should suffice for the most cases. Now, if you can go back to so what we're going to just do is we're going to focus on the define your core, because I think the discussion we were having the other day was that to scale, it's essentially it's a very vulnerable place to be, right? Because you are starting out from, you've kind of worked in a little obviously you're already some level of success has already been there, and it's that should I stay or should I go kind of a situation where, like, if you will, you need to be and I think that conversation came in the very first seminar, that when do you know it's the right time to go, right? So how do you figure out that, okay, now we have this in place, we have the process in place, personnel driven versus process driven, are all the pieces in order to really take that leap of faith, and, like, because the risk can be really high as well. You do not have things in place, and you kind of are, like, split into two different locations, and you're not able to deliver on either of them. That's just your core business, kind of suffering as well. So before you get onto that level of scaling, I think it is quite essential to have that very pragmatically defined core. And what this chapter does in this particular case is helps you narrow it down. So it's a very brief chapter. I would just give a brief outline of it, just to establish some of the ideas, and what are some of the core and what are not core, but sometimes mislabeled as a core. And essentially, in essence, the core is something that you can do better than anyone else who can do that, right? So it's not necessarily movers advantage. It's not a lot of other things, because others can jump into that. What is that one thing that you, as a company, as an organization, can do, which others, at least for a sizable part of your journey, it's something very difficult for them to replicate. So some examples, just to give some clarity on that. Network effect is one of them. The book talks about, where it talks about the eBay, Facebook, LinkedIn, who really leveraged the network effect, where eBay is one great example of, if you do not have enough buyers, it's a two-sided economy. If you do not have enough buyers, enough sellers, you can't have a good business case. Similarly, Facebook, if you only have one friend on Facebook, you're never going to sign up for it, right? We're just having this discussion, how good whether Slack is, WhatsApp, other thing. WhatsApp doesn't have a great thing, but it doesn't have the network effect, so you'll never get onto them, right? A bad example of this is MySpace. I don't know if people remember MySpace from back in the day, but one of the things they really failed at was really leveraging the network effect they already had. Their focus was never there, and Facebook came in and they kind of took that. And the other example is customer service. Now, Amazon and Amazon bought companies, Zappos, a great example, and Nordstrom. All of them, if you think about, now Amazon has other factors working for it as well, but if you think about Nordstrom is a Seattle-based retail store, and they have a return policy which is like unheard of. Like, it was revolutionary when they came up with it, right? And that alone is such a core value that they have, that you can bring anything there for return. They're not even asked for a receipt. Now, although they're a premium store outlet, a lot of people prefer shopping because they kind of see that value that the retailer puts in the customer service. And Zappos is another case where there were tons of shoe outlets. Amazon was already there, but they came in to the shoe segment, and to the point that Amazon eventually had to buy them out. So customer service could be one of the core advantages, the core values that you can have. Low cost is another one, where Walmart and a lot of other entities have made it their key competency. Like, this is the reason people go to Walmart. But the book talks about how a lot of time it cannot be sustainable to keep it a long-term goal, right? So Honda, for example, is a great example of a company that came into the US with the with the low cost as their main core, but eventually they brought a lot more value. And that's the thing. Eventually, whenever there will be Japanese came in with the car market, then followed by Koreans. Now there's going to be Chinese. So that is not a long-term core. That's what it talks about. And I think all of these steps, if you think about it, and the last one is UX, which is Apple is another great example of like, the user experience is all about, how they talk about even the box that you open up.
And Junaid's back.
Yeah, sorry, there was some kind of a disruption there. So talking about the last point the book makes is about the user experience, and obviously the list can go on in terms of what the core competency can be. And all of these points, if you think about it, in some way or the other, do tie into, they are focused about products and they are focused about, entrepreneurial ventures. But if you think about customer service, if you think about network effect, if you think about cost, user experience, all of these can be like transposed into our context of accelerators and incubators as well, right? So if you think about network effect, any entity which already has a massive on-ground footprint, you are more likely going to get, and I see that when I was in Pakistan, I would see that more often than not, that NGOs that have been working for longer obviously have a more established network on the ground. So whenever any grant funding in this case would come in, obviously beyond, let's say, everything else constant, if you have a massive outreach, that obviously has a core value that will prevent others from jumping in. And that's something Celia also talked about, which actually ties it more into the brand positioning, but something similar, right? Where in Cambodia they have a certain brand positioning which helps them get the customer. So all things constant, and a lot of time, that's why the low cost, they talk about in the book that low cost is not going to be the core for long, because eventually people will value other things, or there will be some lower cost competitor who can break into the ranks. Customer service, similarly, who the customer is, in our case, obviously gets a little complicated. There's a customer and there's a beneficiary. So in both ways, in terms of, if you think about the people who are giving out grants, organizations, how well are you able to reach out to them? How well are you able to satisfy their performance indicators, and give all of that? That will ensure that the paying customer in this case has some level of satisfaction. And when you're delivering programs, how well those programs deliver. That's where the UX part comes in as well. That if you have a user experience in terms of the delivery method, we're just talking about even more these the program setups we do, like these online calls and everything. Massive difference, same content, everything. Just by the way the structure is, right? That how many times you're breaking into rooms, how many times you're engaging, all the delivery methods that are there, obviously bring about a change. So all of these things are applicable in our context as well. And later the chapter kind of talks about whether some of the things which should not be thought of as core. One of the first ones that comes up is intellectual property. And the reason they talk about that is that industry, and we talked about it in one of our earlier sessions, the intellectual property can be a core if in some very specific industries. So if you're in the pharmaceutical, or if you're in some very high R&D kind of segments, that might be a necessity. But most of the time, as a general rule of thumb, they talk about that, by the time you will be defining what the IP would be, by the time you will be it's a wasted energy. And unless, again, it's not something which is very heavy science research or something, it's just going to be a futile effort. So that's one of the things not to be considered a core. First mover advantage was a big no-no, because they talk about the notion that it's a delusion in a lot of ways. Now, if you have a good core, the first mover advantage can have a multiplier effect. That you already have let's say a good customer experience, or you have a good low cost. Being the first mover will give you a lead ahead of others, but that's not something you can totally bank on.
Yeah.
So that's definitely not a first mover, is not something that should be considered that way. Locking up supplier, and a few others they talk about. And those are more, again, depending upon your sector and how well you're able to do that. Now, locking up a supplier could be a barrier to others, but unless you're Apple or some massive company, you might not be able to achieve. So, in a nutshell, what it's going back to is that there are certain core values that you should focus on, and those become the barriers for others. Or you can say barrier, you want to say unfair advantage that you have, or whatever terminology you want to use. But that in its own also defines who you are. So it's not about the activity that you do, it's more about defining your own DNA. And that DNA definition, especially when you're scaling up, is going to be important, right? So if you talk about a good customer experience or customer service, the customer service is not just one part of the equation, right? You will have good customer service is not just having more number of people who are sitting in a call center, right? It's more about that even if a CEO of a company sees a negative post somewhere, he in middle of the night responds to it, right? And I've seen that happen. So there's a shoe company, Ellen Edmond. In one of the shoe forums, he actually responded himself. So that is like, the kind of company culture that you are. So building those things and then scaling, that is where I think your strengths will eventually lie, because what you can't do is that you have people who are not really believing in your core competency and your core values, and them going out there and multiplying your work. So at the end of it, those core values have to be built before the scaling actually happens. It's one of those last frontiers before you kind of send the birds out.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Oh,
so that's yeah. So, and any more, if anyone has any questions, you can just I can go on longer lengths talking about the discipline entrepreneurship. So it's going to be a great experience. But the book is good enough of a read to get some of the questions answered. Yeah.
Magic. Thank you so much for doing that guest spot. Really, really good. And the link is in the reading resources for this module. So you can go through, as Junaid said, and if anybody's watching this afterwards, and access the book. And also there's a cracking website as well with online tools as well that helps you to define each of the steps for it. But I think that all the points you raised about the core there as well, that the reason to include that in this module was so much of that sense of when you are scaling programs, and even just program delivery by a new team of people inside your organization in a different location. As you said, if you're not clear on this stuff, then what you end up scaling becomes something different, and that team hasn't got something to build off or follow your company culture or your values, and you end up with a different thing happening in a different place, and you end up scaling problems rather than scaling real simple great solutions and building and enhancing your brand and so on. So it's such a fundamental part of growth. And I know we've used that a lot when we're training different teams, focusing down on what is the core. If you're going to put your energy anywhere, how do you make sure you're delivering the essence of our model? And that's been really crucial. I know that in replication terms as well, companies like McDonald's, when they're doing franchises, they simply don't allow one franchisee to have a second franchise until they've reached quality levels at 90%, I believe it is, across their all indicators across their first replication, and then they can open a second one. And it's only when they've reached, again, quality levels across those two that they could open a third. And there aren't that many franchisees that have got more than 2 or 3. So it's so hard to maintain that quality, stick to that company culture across multiple sites and lead that. So for all of us, it's the stronger we've got that core, the better. But yeah, nicely put. And there was something came up in the webinar as well, I think, that we were talking about earlier around changing gear before you hit the hill, before you climb. And I think this is one of those gear changes. It's getting the core squared away, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, and I think, I mean, scaling generally is I don't want to use the term intimidating proposition, but it definitely is, right? Because there are a lot of what ifs, right? So you're going from a cozy, smaller setup to a larger setup, and essentially all of these things you talked about, they are just minimizing your risk. I mean, things can still go wrong. It's just a matter of mitigating what all can go wrong, and you kind of are more prepared for it.
It can all go wrong tomorrow. That's the beauty of entrepreneurship, isn't it?
Yep.
And actually, we were talking about the picture that was used to intro this this module as well. That I'll flash it up very quickly, because that sense of again, it can all go wrong. Depending on what you're scaling. There we go. I think, can you see there? That's the picture that we used for this module, and we were having that conversation of, if you're scaling something up, are you really sure what it is you're scaling? And do you want to say your observation? Like, it's all very green, it all looks good, but
yeah. So I think when it came up the other day, so at a very superficial read, it's green, right? So how can you go wrong with trees, right? So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And then I was like, I have seen this image before, and it was, I think, a documentary on the orangutan habitat being destroyed because of the palm oil industries, the more and more of their plantation. And what you see in the lower left-hand corner is essentially the farming getting into the forest deforestation. So where you see the palm trees, there used to be forest, right? So it kind of, how do you scale, and what is the cost of that scaling, is something interesting. And we also talked about, a lot of it is all relative as well. I think it's going to go on a different tangent, this conversation, but definitely I think it's worth introspecting that that scaling comes at a cost. So what is that cost? Now, in this case, it's loss of habitat for a lot of wildlife and rainforests. In your organization's case, it can mean a lot of other things as well. Are you ready for that? That's I think the question, right? That if you are a company that cannot operate without face-to-face interaction, then maybe you can't be scaled that easily. If you lose that, and that's a core part of your values, maybe scaling is not the right time for you, or maybe there is no right time. I don't know, but definitely, it's. I think it's this image definitely provokes that thought, right? That what is the cost of scaling, and are you ready to pay that cost?
Yeah, exactly.
And one other thing that came up in that conversation before I wrap it up, there is a book, very interesting read, Founders Dilemmas, and that kind of talks about that that notion a lot, because it obviously talks about an entrepreneurial background, but the dilemmas are the same, right? Whether you are scaling in terms of having other founders coming in, when do you do that, and a lot of other things. So that's another good read. Give it a try. It's also available online. Founders Dilemmas. Yeah. So, and this is one of those dilemmas I would think an organization would have, right? When to scale, if to scale, and all of that.
Absolutely. And staying aware as you're doing it that you can still adapt. You can still adapt your model and make sure you're doing it in a good way that's actually helpful and useful. And yeah, exactly. Well put, Junaid. The other thing I like about this is that the responsible consumption and production. We've all got that finite energy, just like the planet is finite, and really the best use of our resources as well in that scaling journey that is actually sustainable at scale. Some of these things may scale over a couple of years as the markets exist, but as soon as the markets shift, then you have to be agile and use those same resources or change your resources to make sure you keep going. And as you get bigger, you've got a lot more to sustain. So you've got to win more business and so on. And so growth and the whole unicorn thing and pace is what we'll be talking about in the next webinar, actually. And the sales, business development side of what we're doing, how quickly to grow and to what sort of scale are we aiming at. or are we just finding the right sort of size for each of our organizations that can keep going and to keep growing the number of people that are working on impact-led businesses, but not to overshoot or overextend ourselves. So yeah, it's a nice segue for the next webinar.
Sounds good.
Yes,
So I will beg leave at this point, but
yes, it is.
it's great. Like, you know, I hope this ties in with the next one and we carry the same conversation.
Yeah, thank you for joining, Janae. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
My pleasure.
All right, and see everybody in the next webinar. Take care.
Sure.
Thanks.
See you.
Bye.